All right, ladies and gentlemen, so welcome back. Up to this point, we've been talking about how life is evolving from the development of macromolecules to genetic material to prokaryotes to eukaryotes, but all of this thus far has been occurring in the oceans. So eventually, how does life get to land, right? So remember us discussing the oxygen revolution and the evolution of photosynthesis and photosynthetic prokaryotes. So that oxygen revolution, that oxygen eventually bubbling out of the oceans, gives us the development of the ozone layer. Pre that oxygen revolution, remember we talked about the fact that intense solar radiation is coming through the atmosphere and just irradiating land, preventing life from existing because there was no protection for their genetic material. So long as they remained in the oceans, the water was enough of a dampener to that radiation to protect that molecule for them. Oxygen revolution comes about, ozone layer gets produced, and now globally, land and water have protection from that UV radiation and protection for their genetic material. So, well over a billion years ago, things like that cyanobacteria and those other photosynthetic prokaryotes would have started coating a relatively damp terrestrial surfaces wherever they existed. We don't see what we typically think of as land organisms until considerably later than that. Things like plants and fungi, animals, they don't really seem to start colonizing the land until about 500 million years ago, so during the Paleozoic era. And that transition from life in the water to life on land meant that evolutionary adaptations had to occur because now we're taking you out of this completely surrounded watery environment to a much drier environment on land. So the ability for them to move up and out of that water meant that they had to evolve adaptations to prevent from dehydration, and also reproduction was a hurdle to getting on land as well, because when we're talking about organisms in water, most watery organisms, fish and the like, will just spew out sperm, spew out eggs into that watery environment, and eventually those eggs and sperm will meet and produce offspring that way. It's all external fertilization. We got on land, and guess what? Those sperms still need a watery environment to swim in to get to the egg. And yet, that's not going to be possible on land. So, the evolution of internal fertilization also had to come about before these organisms could get onto the land surface. So we see things like vascular tissue plants appearing about 420 million years, um, and a lot of other symbiotic relationships evolve along the way as well. Um, Things like plants and fungi having those mutually beneficial associations, things like the mycorrhizae and that kind of idea also would have needed to evolve. They wouldn't have been able to have access to just nitrogen floating around because atmospheric nitrogen is not something that plants are able to tap into, so they would have needed that association to build things like their amino acids. Arthropods, tetrapods end up being the most widely spread and most diverse land animals, but even they are going to take time before they get from water to land, and so tetrapods seem to have evolved from these lobe-finned fish. Remember I mentioned Tiktaalik to you a few videos ago? That was a big transitional fossil looking at those fish, and then how did we get to four-limbed organisms on land? And it seems to have happened about 365 million years ago. And then there's going to be a lot that ends up shaping Earth once we get these organisms onto land. Um, and the way that life spreads out on that land. So, one of the things that might come up in your textbooks is this idea of snowball Earth. So, we look at climate change being a huge driving factor, not only in the way that land is shaped, but then also the distribution of organisms on those terrestrial surfaces. So, snowball Earth is kind of an interesting concept when we look at climate change. And so, what we know is that Earth has gone through these periods of glaciation and melting, and glaciation and melting, so warming and cooling. And snowball Earth suggests that this was a period of extreme glaciation, where all of life would have been defined and confined, to the equatorial regions, or to deep sea vents from about 750 to 580 million years. Um, and this is some suggestion as to why things like tropical rainforests, which we find right around the equator, seem to have such high biodiversity because they would have had the ability to continue evolving during this time in Earth's history, where things that were further towards the poles would have gotten either killed off, extinct, or would have been pushed back to that equatorial region, and wouldn't have had as much time over Earth's history in order to evolve. One of the biggest jumps in life on Earth was during the Cambrian explosion. And this is where most of our major phyla of animals that we currently still have existing appeared all of a sudden in the fossil record. And of course, when we say all of a sudden, we're still talking geologic time here. So we're talking somewhere between 535 to 525 million years ago. And so all of these major phyla start showing up. Um, a few of them would have shown up, and do show up a little earlier in the fossil record, things like your sponges, your cnidarians, your mollusks. But the vast majority of the organisms and the classification scheme that we have set up didn't really show up until here. This is also where we first start seeing evidence of predator-prey interactions within the fossil record itself, which is pretty cool. So, if we start digging into some DNA analysis, a lot of the animal phyla that we currently have, once again, not only do we see fossil record evidence for this, but we also see genetic diversions for this as well. So, based on that genetic information, we think that Cambrian explosion could have been as early as 700 million years to even 1 billion years ago. And there are fossils in China that provide evidence for a lot of the modern phylates tens of millions of years even before what is typically considered the Cambrian explosion. So there's some suggestion that perhaps it wasn't quite as much of an explosion as the initial fossil record indicated, maybe having sort of what they quote unquote termed a long fuse. So it was a lot of change occurring, but perhaps it didn't occur quite as quickly as some initial evidence suggested. Regardless, we get a huge jump in diversity in the living organisms from this particular event.